Mr. Ray, anything on that?
No.
Okay. Pleasure of the council. Move, Mr. Johnston, second. Mr. Fiorini.
Question, Mr. So the legislature would consider getting total immunity from what responsibility to help with the recovery for after floods? Is that what's being contemplated here?
Mr. Ray.
The federal statute immunizes the Corps of Engineers against liabilities for damages that accrue because of the failure of a flood control project.
Even one that they built? Even one that they built?
Yeah.
And, so they can build it, but then they're not responsible for it if it fails?
Well, of course, the way the federal program works, and you kind of go back to the history of it. One of the concerns when the Corps of Engineers finally took up flood control as a responsibility, early in the 20th century, was that they might be liable. And so among the things that the Congress did was give them that immunity. And they also said that they're not responsible for the maintenance either. That responsibility falls to the local sponsors. Right. And so, of course, often that's a secondary cause of failure. It isn't just the design, it's the combination of design and maintenance. And so in particular, in that situation, the Corps push those responsibilities onto the locals.
Or given to FEMA, or FEMA gets to come in and clean up the mess.
FEMA cleans up the mess, but and even in situations where there's defects in design in a flood control project, my understanding is the Corps doesn't become liable for the damages that are caused. If it's another kind of project the Army's built, a navigation structure, for example, that fails, that leads to a flood, then the Corps can be held liable if they're shown to be negligent. I think that's the situation.
And the rationale for this grows out of the fact that the federal government engaged in active encouragement of conversion of what they called swamplands into other areas. And as you know, in our statute, one of the legislative findings points out that the original Swampland Act, the Arkansas Act, and then later California amendments included language that said it's the responsibility of the property owners to protect themselves. Because when you encourage development in a flood-threatened area, it should hardly come as a shock that you're flood-threatened. And accordingly, that's what I think the whole discussion's all about. Everyone said, well, hell! You let me come here. You might have to protect me. I mean, it's the argument about who should help provide the protection that's needed. So, this is rich history. Rich history.
Well, we can take a vote on it. It just seems again for something that a physical feature that's built and designed that's different than allowing people to build in a forested area or on an earthquake fault or behind a levee and so forth. I mean, I understand the history and I appreciate the history on it. It just seems to me that, if everybody walks away, going back to Dan's point about recovery, at some point, things that are built can fail, and sometimes it's people responsible for that. Other times they're not. It's the act of nature, or it's things aren't maintained properly and so forth. But I don't give absolute immunity to something that was designed. I mean, it's kind of like having people warrant and stand behind the things that they do. So
yeah, I don't think this deals with emergency response and dealing with things that way. This is talking about longer-term, big-picture liability issues that I was personally involved after the state lost a lawsuit that cost $500 million, a couple of lawsuits that together cost $500 million in terms of liability.
Paterno.
And one of the real concerns over the long term is if the state's going to continue to be liable when it assists local agencies with doing flood control projects, maybe financially it's better for the state not to assist and just let that liability remain with the local agency. And so if you really want the state to invest, it makes sense that you actually provide some immunity to the state for actually stepping up and helping. At least we actually made this recommendation in a flood white paper that DWR did while I was there, and
that was a 2005 white paper.
And it's unlikely that this will actually be acted on, but I think it's important that we make the case that there are institutional barriers sometimes that cause the state and sometimes local agencies to have the same problem. And I know local agencies have asked for the same level of immunity, and the legislature hasn't hasn't passed.
Well, I think those explanations are important, and again, this would allow the legislative process to work its way out, or if it went to some sort of initiative that would allow folks to vote on it, so I'm okay with that. So.
Okay, we've got a motion. I'm sorry, Ms. Gray?
Did you say this language does not apply to emergencies? Is that what you said?
Joe?
So what I said is, so if you have an emergency, say you have a failure, it does not apply to the state saying, I'm not going to come out and help you. So that this is intended for the liability that occurs. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, we have a motion. We have a second, starting with Mr. Johnston.
Fiorini, aye.
Eisenberg, aye.
Totally aye.
Okay, 5-0 on that. All right, I think a couple people came in late. There is on the table outside a one-page sheet, top of which says WRP1, which is the proposal that we'll be considering hopefully by 1 o'clock by Mr. Johnston and Mr. Fiorini that they've worked out. We're going to come back to that. Second notation at some point, which means right now Mr. Natoli and Mr. Grindstaff are going to figure out how to have a conversation on item number 11. So let's go to Bethel Island and get a full report, Ms. Messer, if you can, again, please, on the status of your calls to Bethel Island.
Okay. Again, I talked to two individuals, Supervisor PIFO and Mr. Stephen Getz from the county's planning department. And when I talked to Supervisor PIFO, I asked her the questions regarding whether or not she felt Bethel Island should be considered a legacy community. She said yes, it should. Her list of reasons included the community wants it. They feel that it will allow them to maintain their current status. The county is supportive of it. I also heard that from Mr. Getz. And then she mentioned the DPC's report regarding Bethel Island being included into the primary zone, though I know they did not take a stand one way or another on that. And lastly, she indicated that the county's position is that the entire island should be included as a legacy community. We talked about the possible fifth option of removing that from our list for purposes of Delta Plan policies. She felt that would be counter to the county's position right now. And again, she just reiterated that she would like this item to be moved to our next meeting for discussion to allow the county's planning team to review the options, have some...
What did she explain what she meant by help them keep their status or something like that?
She did not. I'm sorry. I was just writing things as she was stating them.
Randy.
So it sounds to me like their request is to include the entire island as a legacy community, which is inconsistent with the way we've designated all other legacy communities. I would reaffirm the motion that I offered earlier for 9 and 10 and delete the reference regarding legacy communities in Bethel Island and allow them to bring that issue up separately at a later date.
So for purposes of preparing the modifying the staff plan, Mr. Fiorini's motion is to delete the reference to Bethel Island as a legacy community, but allowing the county to bring the issue up at a later time this year. So later